Yeah, I bet you think you know what this video is gonna be all about, huh? This silly internet man is gonna tell us how the Imperium of Man is just Rome in space. Yeah, you'd like that, you wouldn't. What? Yeah, you'd like that, wouldn't you, you rat? Well, maybe I don't want to talk about the Catholic space Nazis, huh? Maybe I want to talk about something else instead. Maybe instead of talking about the Adeptus Copyrightus and Spacis, that's the Imperium, I want to talk about the funny little short guys with beards and axes to grind. What are you gonna do then, huh? Yeah, that's right. Today I'm talking about how the Roman Empire influenced the dwarfs of Warhammer Fantasy. That's right. No space soldiers for you today. Alright, I'll talk about the space guys too. Anyways, the Roman Empire. You know what it is, don't say you don't. Arguably the world's most influential civilization for a variety of reasons. Also something Europe has been trying to recreate in one form or another for the last 1500 years. Sometimes kind of successfully, sometimes with some hiccups, and sometimes you get Mussolini the clown and whatever the hell he was doing. And on occasion, someone tries to create a version of it in fiction. And thus did we get the Imperium of Man. If you've ever looked at any Warhammer 40k content, then you could tell they're based on the Romans. I mean, look at the language of High Gothic. Astra Militarum, Adeptus Astartes, Adeptus Mechanicus, it's all in Latin. Or should I say it's all in discount Latin, because if GW made everything in proper Latin terminology and grammar, then they couldn't copyright stuff. I mean, you can't copyright a language after all, as hard as you might try. Don't think we forgot Spots the Space Marine, GW. I'll never forget. So anyways, yeah, Latin. The language Rome spaked and the language the Imperium wholeheartedly ripped off, and a whole lot more, of course. The ruler of the Imperium is nominally the Emperor, which, you know, Rome had emperors when it was an empire. Now there's a twist. And the High Lords are a rough equivalent of the Senate. Did you know there's actually dozens of High Lords in the Imperium? There's a whole governing body of them. They have big meetings and everything just like the Roman Senate. And also just like the Romans, they're all massively, unbelievably corrupt. True, the Imperium never sold the position of Emperor off to the highest bidder, but I imagine that's less because none of them wanted to, and more because if you try and kill the Emperor, the best case scenario is death by custodes, and the worst is you've just opened a new gaping asshole in reality. How's that for mental imagery? Interestingly, the Roman emperors also used to claim divine heritage, if not outright being a god themselves, which sort of makes them the god emperor on Earth. Just like the Warhammer one, huh? Of course, he has a little bit more backing when people claim he's a god, given that he is one. Although that itself is also a contrast to Rome, because Olympi never wanted to be worshipped as a god, and indeed hated religion, which backfired immensely, but it's still neat. The Space Marines in the era of 30k during the Great Crusade also used to be organized in legions, which is, again, another obvious copy and paste from Rome. It gets really obvious when you look at the Ultramarines. I know people forget it sometimes, but they were originally supposed to be Romans in space even more than the rest of the Imperium, not just Mary Sue's and power armor. I mean, look at this. That's just Alexander the Great leading a Roman legion. Plus, their concept of adaptability mirrors Rome's. You can wrongfoot them once, but they're going to figure out what went wrong and come back for round 2 stronger than ever. Unless you're the Germans, then they realize you aren't worth the effort and leave you with your shit forest to claim victory over. There's also the Gothic architecture that the Imperium is littered with, which is itself inspired by Roman architecture, so that's another layer of inspiration for your inspiration. But you know what? This is a lot of surface level stuff. Like, yeah, of course, when you hear the word legion, you think of Rome. That was their military, the Roman legions. But there's actually a lot of interesting examples of the Imperium taking inspiration from the Romans that not as many people talk about. The Great Crusade itself, for example. When you hear the term Great Crusade, you probably think of massive battles in the name of a higher power or greater cause, and sure enough, there were plenty of those happening. But many Primarchs like Guilliman, Lorgar, and Horus used diplomacy to bring worlds into the Imperial fold. Sure, if they said no, then it was time to rain hellfire down on them, but that's what the Romans did too. If you said yes, then congratulations, welcome to Rome, here's your aqueduct. But if you said no, then it was time to break out the crosses and show the world that you too can be like the Son of God in ways you probably never wanted. Also from the Great Crusade, I think it can be argued that the Emperor may be a roundabout reference to Roman dictatorship during the Republican years. For reference, the Romans used to, in times of crisis, elevate someone to a position of supreme power. This was to cut through bureaucratic red tape, because when the barbarians are at the gates, there's no time to fill out the forms at the DMV. Someone's just gotta go out there and get shit done. When the crisis was over, the dictator would step down and normal procedures would return. Now, of course, the Emperor never stepped down, but that wasn't because he didn't want to eventually. Remember, he said that his Imperium was for humanity to be ruled by humanity. If he wanted to retain unlimited power forever, why would he set up positions of power for mortal humans or allow them control over Horus after his promotion to War Master? It's possible that if the Emperor's dreams came to fruition, he too would one day step down from power once he felt the crisis was averted and that mankind was no longer in danger. If not completely, then at least to an extent that he was in charge more in name than for practical reasons. Maybe start a nice farm like Cincinnatus did when he was finished being dictator of Rome. As for the Primarchs, it's possible they themselves could be considered consuls of a sort, though that might be stretching it a bit. During the Republic, the Romans would elect 2 consuls to rule. They both had massive amounts of power, but they could each veto each other and only served 1 year before another pair of Romans was elected. And the Senate still had plenty of power itself, so it wasn't a tyranny of two. If there was a war, one could go off to fight battles, while the other could remain home to handle administrative duties. While the Primarchs certainly weren't voted in, being God's test tube babies and all, they did have a large amount of power that imperial politicians back home could still influence with their own. They handled joint military and administrative duties, given that several Primarchs would ensue the worlds they subjugated would be up to standard before moving on. And the Emperor did eventually plan for them to retire from commanding duties to let regular humans take over. Whether or not they would be allowed to into official retirement like the Romans or straight up murdered is for debate and varies between Primarch to Primarch. Looking at you, Angron. But they were going to step down eventually either way. This could be a bit of a stretch though, like I said. Also, none of the Roman consuls were wizards, at least as far as archaeology can tell us, which is a shame. The Imperium's legal system too is influenced by the Romans, though perhaps more by the Byzantine codification of it than the original Roman empires. Of course, the Byzantines were just the Romans, so that point is kinda moot. And to me, the biggest way the Imperium mirrors Rome is how despite going through numerous crises that should have wiped it out, it's held strong. Rome should have fallen apart several times. I mean, when your head general marches into your capital to assume total control only to later be stabbed to death, your country probably isn't doing so hot. And when it erupts into civil war every time the emperor looks the other way, it really shouldn't last past the afternoon. Julius Caesar, the crisis of the 3rd century, the Huns, Rome should have fallen long before it did, but it always adapted. When it became just a bit too corrupt for even the most awful senator to bear, someone like Aurelian would rise up and start fixing shit. When it shattered like glass into civil wars, someone would manage to come out on top and bring it back together. When it became too big to manage, they just cut it in half to ease the burden. Rome managed to hold on for far longer than could be reasonably expected. The Imperium too is well past its expiration date, but like Rome, it keeps chugging along. Look at the time periods of imperial history. You can see it has ups and downs that should have ended it, but it would always come back together. The Horus Heresy probably should have ended it then and there, but it kept going strong, and after that, there's a time of rebirth and the forging, where despite plenty of issues, the Imperium is coming out on top and better than it was after the heresy. The Nova Terra Interregnum, god what a stupid name, mirrors the crisis of the 3rd century and probably should have also killed the Imperium, but it still kept going, though weaker than before this time. Same with the Age of Apostasy and the Waning. You can clearly see it's weakening, but mankind is still going forward. By the time of ending, which was where 40k was before Kata got rocked like a hurricane, the Imperium was much like Rome before the East-West split. Clearly it's falling apart and the capital sucks, but some places are still shining beacons of glory, much like Rome to Constantinople or indeed Terra to Macragge. And we finally get to where we are now in 40k. The Imperium is split between the parts where the Astronomicon shines, which is where its hope of continuing on lies, and the Dark Imperium, where it's pretty clearly falling apart and just needs one good kick before it does. Exactly the same as the Eastern and Western Roman empires, just with more rape demons. But you know what? The Imperium isn't the only way Games Workshop took inspiration from Rome. In fact, it wasn't even the first way. No, believe it or not, that honor belongs to the dwarfs of fantasy. Now, of course, before you say it, there's the obvious place they take inspiration from. They're dwarfs. Just copy and paste The Lord of the Rings and your workday is done. Go take an early lunch. But while they are just Tolkien ripoff number whatever, they take a surprising amount of inspiration from the Romans too. Which is shocking, because when I think of dwarfs, I think of angry bearded alcoholics, but it's true. First off, the dwarfs fill the role of the Romans as a precursor civilization to the modern day of the setting. For Europe, Rome has influenced pretty much every culture in some way, shape, or form. I mean, the Romance languages have it in their name. Romance. It's given its architecture, culture, government, you name it. And it's very much the same for Warhammer, just the dwarfs are still around as opposed to the Romans. The dwarfs gave humanity, or at least the Empire, the basis of nearly everything it has. Technology, materials, hell, even early human language was based on the dwarf language, Khazalid. It may be a language that sends me into rage when Barden says something utterly incomprehensible instead of just saying the words gas rat that way, but it's still a language they gave nonetheless. The most interesting bit of this is that in the Empire, all of the holy texts are in ancient Khazalid, just like how the Bible was written in Latin for the longest time. And in much the same way, a huge amount of European cities like London were built on old Roman forts or towns, many of the Empire cities were built on old dwarven ruins, or at least near their holds. Of course, the dwarfs also take after Rome in a much less fortunate way for them. They're sort of like a quasi-Byzantine empire. Granted, the dwarfs never split in half to ease administrative burden, but much like Rome towards the end, they're a shadow of their former glory. They're constantly under attack from outside forces. Little by little, the borders shrink and more holds fall to the scum of the earth, like Skaven, greenskins, and worst of all, giant toads causing the tectonic plates to shift. Truly, the Warhammer fantasy world was a place of great evil. The positioning of what's left of most of the dwarfs also kind of mirrors where the Byzantines were located geographically. The Byzantines were located in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and the dwarfs are located in the eastern half of not Europe. Of course, there are ways they differ. The dwarfs have good relationships with Sigmar's empire, seeing them as good allies and friends, despite the fact that they're shoddily made human beings. The Byzantines and the Holy Roman Empire, Well, they could have hated each other more, I guess. Certainly wasn't friendly, but they weren't actively genociding each other, and on occasion there was a very tense deal worked out between the two powers. Either way, much frostier relations than the Empire of Man and the dwarfs. However, this and other differences, like how the dwarfs never had a major religious change and eventually schism, doesn't seem like GW not doing their history right. Feels more like they're actually making something unique and creative. Or at least taking the time to rip off Tolkien some more instead of real life. So there we have it, how Rome influenced not only Warhammer 40k, but also Warhammer Fantasy. Isn't it crazy how much mileage you can get out of a single topic? All it takes is for that topic to be a 2 millennia spanning empire that influenced the entire planet. Thanks for watching and take care. Seriously though, Barden screaming in Khazla drives me to the depths of rage when he says some shit like, "There's a Karak Bak Dringle," and then I get riddled with bullets like a fish in a fucking barrel.